It's time for another CGC census count video. This time it's 1952. We're in the pre-code horror age, but the top of the list is still dominated by some famous properties. We'll see all the books on the top 10, plenty of other keys, up next on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hello, panelologists. This is Jim from Bronzeville Comics coming to you with another video. We're going to do the CGC census count. We've been doing this since pre-1935, and we're up this year to 1952. And we're going to count down the top 10. We're going to look at some other keys from 1952 to see where they fit in the census count. And we're also going to take a look at the top book from each of the major publishers and a lot of the minor publishers as well. And I also take a look at the books that have the highest values. Looking at books that, like, in 8.5 down, have sold on Heritage for over $10,000. It's kind of a pretty good benchmark for some of these books. And some of them, we'll see, are quite rare. So let's take a look at the list. We're going to start at number 10, and we're going to go to EC Comics. And number 10 on the list is Weird Science number 16, which has a Wally Wood cover. And this is actually the ones that are on the list interesting are not the more grotesque books, not necessarily the books that are more valued by collectors today. We've said over the last couple of years, we're not quite at the most grotesque yet of the pre-code horror from any of the publishers. So this particular book, of all the books on the top 10, has the highest mean grade of 6.32, and it does have 168 copies in the census. We move to a tie for number 8, and it is one of those books is Weird Fantasy number 16, which is really also a science fiction book. This is an Al Feldstein cover, and it does have a connection to the book that it's tied with, and we'll go briefly to that as well. That's Weird Fantasy number 15, which has also an Al Feldstein cover. The science fiction books, I guess there are just more of them out there, and maybe they were probably less likely to be purged and burned during the seduction of the innocent period. So both Weird Fantasy 15 and 16 tied for 8th on the list, and they both have a census count of 175. Now, we're going to go more to pure horror. And we are at number 7 on the list. And it is Shock Suspense Stories number 1. This has a cover by Al Feldstein, an electrocution cover. Again, not as grotesque as we would see later on, but it is the first issue in the series and does have a census count of 199. Now, we're going to go to number 6 on the list, and it is Batman number 6. With this Two-Face cover, Batman is the most collectible character from this part of the Golden Age. He did maintain his strength. I think at the time Superman was more popular, and Superman is certainly more popular in the 1960s prior to the television series. But in the long run, collectors today seek out Batman more. And this particular book, with a Win Mortimer cover. This is a Two-Face 2 Paul Sloan in it. There was a second Two-Face kind of a I don't think a copycat is the right term, but just a similar villain. But also has Harvey Dent in it. And this particular book has 209 copies in the census. Move to number 5. It's Batman number 69, a Catwoman cover with the King of Cats, Kyle. His first appearance. The cover is by Win Mortimer, Batman and Robin tied up. I do like this cover. It kind of reminds me, with the King of Cats aside, of one of those classic Julie Newmar episodes from the 1960s where she'd kind of be in her lounging on her kind of cat throne. This has a census count of 212. Not veering too far, it's Batman number 73. And of course, what's going to be most popular? A Joker cover, the Joker's utility belt. And this was actually adapted into a pair of episodes for the Batman 66 TV series. It was actually the first appearance of the Joker in January of 1966, episodes 5 and 6, entitled the pair of episodes The Joker is Wild and Batman is Riled, largely based on this particular comic book. Joker covers are going to be the most popular Batman covers, generally speaking, and this particular book does have a census count of 260. So Batman 73 has a census count of 260. Let's go to number 3 on the list, and it's a Superman book, but it contains Batman. It's Superman number 76, and it is the first team-up of Superman and Batman. They had been together in the same story in a couple of issues of All-Star Comics with the Justice Society, but that also included other heroes. This is really the first team-up of Superman and Batman, and I was lucky enough to get a copy of this issue last year. Really cool book, and it kind of, for DC, this marked the first appearance of the Earth 1 versions of the characters. The kind of the Silver Age. It doesn't really mark the beginning of the Silver Age for Superman or Batman, but they kind of put this as the demarcation between the two. Just, it's rather arbitrary. Anyway, this does have a census count of 335. Now, for number 1 and 2, day to day, this could change because there was one issue difference between the two, and these are the top 2 books that we've seen so far on the census count going all the way back. At number 2 is from EC Comics Mad number 1. This is not Mad Magazine because these first several issues were comic book size before magazine size. It was the first satire comic. It gave birth to a whole bunch of horror satire. Horror was, as we'll see as we're going throughout this list, horror was the story of the day. Harvey Kurtzman cover here, and it is it started a classic run of Mad Magazine, which was a staple. I think even had more cultural impact than any particular superhero title. It ran for 448 issues all the way through 2010. And it was just a cultural force to be reckoned with. Actually, it ran for 505 issues. I'm sorry. So, yeah, this a classic book, and Mad number 1 comes in at number 2 on our list, and there are a total of 605 copies in the census. Top book on the list is 4-color number 386, which is essentially Uncle Scrooge number 1. Not his first appearance, a Carl Barks story, cover, and art, so it has all of that going for it. And what happened with a lot of these 4-color issues, Dell would highlight a different character or a different intellectual property, really, in each of these issues, and sometimes they'd give them second and third runs in 4-color. And what they would eventually do is, if in this case when Uncle Scrooge got his own comic book, this was kind of retroactively made issue number 1. There were 3 issues in 4-color before, in 1953, he got his first book, which ended up running, 404 issues? So Uncle Scrooge, a very long-running title. And there are 606 copies on the census, one more than Mad Magazine, right? When I first started doing the research for this, I was looking at it and I go, okay, and Mad was ahead of Uncle Scrooge, 4-color, and then 4-color took over. So that does it for the top 10. Now we're going to take a look at books outside the top 10 that have other key significance or are pricey or the leading book from their particular publisher. We're going to go next to DC Comics and another long-running series that ran for 31 years till 1983. And this is House of Mystery #1. Win Mortimer and Charles Paris cover. It's the first DC horror comic. And it is a little bit, I would say, more muted, certainly, than the other horror books of the time, because House of Mystery was able to survive as a title through the Comic Code Authority. And this, you know, I guess this one, when Wanda was a werewolf. So, again, they didn't get as horrific. And maybe because DC, like Dell, already had an established bullpen of titles with Superman and Batman, etc., that they didn't want to risk alienating part of their fan base and the parents of those fan base. So this particular book has a census count of 127. Magazine Enterprise's top book of 1952 is a nice key. It's Thunder #1, and it is the only comic book completely drawn by Frank Frazetta. This is Frank Frazetta cover, obviously, one of the most admired artists in comic book history, really. He ended up doing the first issue of Vampirella, and by the time we got into the 1960s, he was doing more painted cover work. He wasn't really doing many interiors, just because he was doing movie posters. And I really recommend, just recently, Comic Tropes did a whole episode on Frank Frazetta. A lot of information there. He did a ton of research. I'm not really going to talk that much more about Frank Frazetta, although I will point out at this point in time, he was doing some stories for DC on The Shining Knight in Adventure Comics. And, of course, that being a member of the Seven Soldiers of Victory is one of, a preferred character of mine. But this particular issue of Thunder by Frazetta has a census count of 121. And again, go check Comic Tropes for a great history of the career of Frank Frazetta. Next book on the list is another DC book. It's Detective Comics 187, Two-Face cover done by Win Mortimer. I picked this book because it does have a very low average grade of just 3.86, which means that this is a book that's going to be submitted in lower grades. It's a very collectible book. And Detective, not as popular with collectors as Batman. We've talked about that in the past. There aren't as many issues on the census, at least. But this particular one does it still attract collectors, and it does have a census count of 108. We're going to stay with DC for a first appearance. This is one of the first characters DC ever put out. There are very few characters in general that had their first appearance in their own self-titled issue #1. Phantom Stranger is one of them, right? This particular book is Phantom Stranger #1 from DC Comics. It has a Carmine Infantino cover and art. Infantino, I tell you, I talked about this in the last couple episodes. He was, just hitting on all cylinders at this point in time. Just 6 issues ran between 52 and 53 of the Phantom Stranger. And then he would come back in 1968 and be part of the DC universe ever since. This is like on this list. This is a spec book, right? There's at least one more really good spec book for me on this list. We don't have a lot of spec books from 1952, not a lot of first appearances, but Justice League Dark, they would almost have to use Phantom Stranger. They did have it in the Swamp Thing TV series. I don't think it was, I wasn't bowled over by that incarnation of the character. I really like the Swamp Thing series, but I didn't think they did the Phantom Stranger just right. But this also has Murphy Anderson art. This is a want of mine, this particular book. And it does have an average grade of just 3.68, and there are 104 copies on the census. Next, we're going to go to the top book from Star Publications, and this is Startling Terror Tales #11 with an L.B. Cole cover. This is a big, expensive book. One of the most expensive books of 1952, I would say, grade for grade. You have this awesome cover with the spider with the skull. and like the woman in peril and the guy, gosh knows what's wrong with him. The ghost spider of death. We're going to see a lot of horror on this list. Every publisher was putting out a horror book, and I probably trying to re-up the next one. And we'll see a lot of similar themes in the covers. This particular comic does have 103 copies on the Census, but it is an expensive book. Up next is the top book from Atlas Comics, which would become Marvel. This is Journey into Mystery #1 with a Russ Heath cover, great artist. And this is the book that 82 issues later was the first appearance of Thor and eventually became Thor. This is where it started. Atlas jumping into the horror genre. They had some horror books already, and we'll see a couple of others on the list. They obviously had the Captain America horror books just before that series was canceled a few years earlier. But Atlas was doing a lot of different things, and horror was one of them in 1952, and this has 102 copies on the Census and an average grade of just 3.93. Now, compare this to other pre-code horror books of, I guess, similar covers, right? In terms of the renown of the artist, the macabre level of the subject matter. This is This is not one of the more horrific pre-code horror covers. It's average horror, I guess. Russ Heath, a fairly renowned artist at the time, but I think this gets a lot of buzz because it did eventually become the first appearance of Thor later on in the run, and it was a staple of Marvel Comics through the 1960s. Let's go to the next book on the list, and this is the top book from Fiction House. This is Planet Comics number 66. This is a cover by Maurice Whitman, and what do you need on the cover of Planet Comics? You need a spaceship, you need a damsel in distress, you need bubble helmets, and a ray gun. And you pretty much have all of those. You got some aliens, too. That's always good to throw in. And you kind of have the guy up there who looks like the prototype of Green Arrow. But the Fiction House was still holding on fairly strong at this point in time. They would be going for a little while longer. And this has 89 copies on the Census for Planet Comics number 68. From Avon is the Dead Who Walk, no number. Again, a horror cover. I don't think this is one of the better rendered horror covers. You do have kind of the headlights on the woman there with all of these ghouls and whatever. Anne's beauty has beckoned me from the horrors of death. She'll be mine now. She doesn't really look excited about that prospect. But there are 87 copies of this on the Census, which ties it with the top book from Aragon Publications, which is Weird Tales of the Future, number 4. This does have a cover by Basil Wolverton and Ed Robbins. Wolverton also did work for EC. And it combines horror and sci-fi. And front and center, you have that woman in distress, and you have these, I don't know what they are, flying alien thingy creatures, and they're holding that guy. Again, we're going to see a lot of horror, and from a lot of different publishers, and this does have a Census count of 87. Up next, from Star Publications, their top book of the year. No, actually, Starting Terry Tales was their top book. But this is the top blue ball. I really like this cover. This is another L.B. Cole cover. And, it does have those L.B. Cole tropes of basically being very bold with just primary colors. And there are 82 copies of this on the Census. Up next, and this is a great book. This is the top book from Harvey. It's Harvey Comics Library number 1, but that title is kind of relegated to the upper left-hand corner of this book. It is better known as Teenage Dope Slaves, as exposed by Rex Morgan, MD, who I think, and I've looked at this before when I did a primer on Harvey, there was a comic strip, Rex Morgan, MD, and that ran like from 1948 to present. It's still running. So, yeah, comic book character Rex Morgan is the one that's putting this comic out. This kid really needs his dope. Please, I'll get the money somehow. Somehow don't count. Cash in the line, sucker. No shot. Yeah. So this is a very sensational cover, very sought after by collectors, and it does have a census count of 79. Another Star Publications, another expensive LB Cole cover. This is Startling Terror Tales number 10. And this kind of octopusy cyclops alien character, the horrible entity, has this guy in distress. And again, the bold primary colors, the greens, the yellows, the reds, and the black background. This is, again, in higher grade, like probably the 7-8 range. You're probably going to have to pay 5 figures for this book. And this does have a census count of, let me find it, Startling Terror Tales number 10 has a census count of 79. Another Detective Comics. This is Detective Comics 184 with a Win Mortimer cover, and this is the first appearance of the Firefly, who would be a Batman villain for many years to come. Was it Firefly or Firebug that was supposed to be in the Batgirl film, played by Brendan Fraser? I am not sure. But this is Firefly's first appearance, the human Firefly, and I think it was maybe Firebug. Any rate, this particular book does have a census count of 71. Another Atlas book, and another very expensive book. This is one of the more expensive books of the era. This is Atlas Comics, Venus number 19, the final issue of the run. It does have a Bill Everett cover, and he also produced story and interior art. And again, what do you got? You got the woman in distress. You got the skeleton that's trying to make out with her. Just, again, pushing the envelope of pre-code horror. We're going to see, starting to see somewhat more horrific elements. Venus is a run that a lot of collectors gravitate towards because it did kind of start with superheroes, and Venus is still in use in Marvel Comics, but then it got into pre-code horror. And there are 69 copies of this on the census. From Youthful Magazines, another horror book. This is Chilling Tales number 13, the first issue of this series. Previously was Beware. It does have a Matt Fox cover. The Screaming Skull. So, I don't know, this monster is kind of pulling this guy out of the grave. No real explanation, but this particular book has a census count of, of 68. War books. There are a couple of war books on this list. This is from Comic Media, their top book. It's a Don Heck cover. I'm not a big fan of Don Heck, but we'll leave it at that. His style was, I think, less rushed at this point in time, and it was contemporary for the early 1950s. This is a part of cover image used for Horrific number 3's cover, and which is, same company. This has 67 copies on the census. From American Comics Group, Skeleton Hand number 1, a Ken Bald cover. Again, you got this skeleton playing the violin and all sorts of other monsters hanging around. American Comics Groups lasted well into the 1960s, and this is an issue number 1 from them that has a census count of 65. From Farrell, their top book, and it's Voodoo number 1. It does have Matt Baker interior art, so you're combining Matt Baker with horror, and that he was doing a lot of romance around this time, but fewer romance books on the list this week as compared to previous weeks. So that makes this book, it's the number 1 as well. Very popular, 62 copies on the census, which ties it with a number 1 from DC, and that's Our Army at War, number 1. This book would last and eventually became Sergeant Rock, which lasted till issue 422 in the 1980s. I don't remember the exact year. This has a Carmine Infantino cover, and it does have a mean grade of just 3.93 and a census count of 62. Another very expensive book. This one is from Aragon. This is Weird Tales of the Future number 3. We saw number 4 on the list previously. This is a Basil Wolverton cover. And yeah, this is an expensive book that has just 62 copies on the Census, Woman in the Red Dress, the whole 9 yards. Another book from Avon. This is Witchcraft number 2. This is a Joe Kubert and Sick Czech art. I don't know who did the cover of this. You got the skeleton cover. That's what is going to make this popular. The mean grade on the Census is just 3.80, which is really low for a book from the 50s. I mean, the 50s books weren't saved that much better than the 40s books. But it does mean this low average grade means that people are more than willing to submit this for grading when it's in a little bit rougher condition. Let's go to the top book from Fawcett for 1952, and that is one of the final issues of Captain Marvel Jr. I think the Marvel family lasted until 1954. This is a Bud Thompson cover, well past the days of McAvoy. But astonishingly, and maybe it's the fact that he's punching out eyeballs on the cover, that is noted in the label of this book. But it does have a census count of 58, which isn't that low. It did the final issue would be 4 issues later, which would be 1953, issue 119. Another book from Comic Media, this time a horror book. It's Horrific number 1. Flames, this ghoulish conductor, and the ballerina dancing maybe to her eternal doom. I don't know, but this does have 57 copies on the Census. Another Atlas book, another issue of Venus. This is the penultimate issue, Venus 18, with a Bill Everett cover. And again, you can see the horror elements very much on display here. And this, as I said, it's a penultimate issue, also a very expensive one. It's hard to fill out this Venus run because these pre-code horror books are pretty well sought after. And this has a census count of just 54. The top book from Ace Periodicals is Atomic War number 1. This has, obviously, an atomic bomb going off. It looks like New York City. They got the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. Only a strong America can prevent atomic war. There's a hanging panel. Propaganda. We're in the midst of the McCarthy era, and the threat of atomic war was real at the time. That was kind of a preoccupation, even to sell something to kids, potentially. 54 copies on the Census. Another Aragon, and another, this is, has a very low average grade of just 3.87. This has a cover by Tony Mortellaro. And it's a classic bondage cover. The woman in the red dress tied up, being lowered into the vat of acid, and you got the ghoul, or the guy at least with the skeleton mask and the hood. Guys in hoods, they like that. And a hero in the background looks like trying to come to a rescue, but not being successful at it. Mr. Mystery number 6 has a census count of 53. From Toby Press, I actually had a copy of this in a collection. This is Tales of Horror number 1. This is Terror Man. Read the Ugliest Man in the World. Cover here by Myron Fass. Again, these smaller publishers, and they're kind of pushing the envelope, right? They're going a little horrific a little earlier than EC would. This particular book has a census count of 51. Another expensive book from Avon. This is City of the Living Dead. No number. It's the only issue. It has a cover by A.C. Hollingsworth. You got this tied-up ghoul and the woman with the jodhpurs and the whip. I'm not exactly sure what she's up to, but a very low average grade of 3.80 for the 50 copies on the Census. Top book from Ziff Davis is Space Patrol #1. This does have a cover by Norman Saunders and was based on an ABC television series. Painted cover. Fact of the matter is, these TV series from the early 1950s are largely lost. They weren't really syndicated. They were not really very well preserved in any sort of original condition. If they were just like, recorded on, only recordings were on Kinescope, whereas other shows like I Love Lucy, a show that lasted, they filmed a show on film, and Desi Lu kept those film images, and that is why, one of the reasons also, like, it was just such a classic show that it became a staple of syndication in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The top book from Gilmore magazines, Hy Fleischman and Nick Frank art, an electrocution panel of Weird Mysteries #1. You have kind of this witchy-looking character with these zombies, and of course, front and center, a woman in distress in like lingerie. This has a average grade of just 4.26 and 49 copies in the Census. This is an interesting one. The top book from Quality Comics. Dollman's still being published, but the top book on the Census from 1952 for Quality Comics is GI Combat #1, which has a Reed Crandall cover, one of the most underappreciated artists of the Golden Age. He's just terrific. GI Combat, eventually, when Quality went out of business, GI Combat was published by DC Comics for many years, was, one of the standards of their war books into the 1980s. And GI Combat ran for 288 issues all the way through to 1987. This is issue #1, and that's what's going to make it a popular book for collectors. It's a #1 of a title that ran for a very long time. One of the handful of war books on the list for this particular year. 46 copies on the Census. Top book from Prize Publications is Frankenstein #19, Dick Briefer cover. This Frankenstein started with issue #1. At this point in time, I'd never read it, but at some point in time, they transitioned from more of a humorous approach to a darker, more horror-based approach to the books. This has a Census count of 45. Top book from St. John Publications, which did a lot of romance with Matt Baker, but now let's get into horror. Weird Horrors #1. It does have a Gus Rika cover. I think that the impact of the cover, and look at the line work on the guy asleep there and the cross hatching in the background. Gus Rika is really excellent. Weird Horrors #1. I think the extra, kind of panels on the left-hand side of the cover does detract from the cover. If this had just been a larger main image, I think it would have been more effective. At least maybe not selling to kids in 1952, but to grown-ups in 2025. Anyway, this is the top book from St. John's, and it has a Census count of 44, which ties it with our next book, the top book from Eastern Color, and it's Buster Crabbe #5 with a Frank Frazetta cover. Buster Crabbe was, at this point in time, he was a Western star, but he had previously been in the movies, best known for playing Buck Rogers in movie serials in the 1930s and 40s. He also played Flash Gordon, but he first came to fame in 1932 when he won the 400-meter freestyle swimming event at the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. And it was the only event that American men won in 1932, as the Japanese men dominated the swimming pool that year. So Buster Crabbe kind of became an overnight sensation. I think he played Tarzan a couple times as well. But what Buster Crabbe is not what's selling this book. It's Frank Frazetta. And this kind of would set him up for some of his EC books and some of his famous funnies that we will see in the next couple of years. Now, here's a first appearance, and it's actually two tied first appearances. This is the top book from United Features Syndicate for this year. It is Tip Top Comics #173, and it ties for the first appearance of the Peanuts in comic books. Now, the Peanuts had already appeared in newspaper strips by Charles Schulz. This is hurt by the fact that the Peanuts are not on the cover, right? The strip began in 1950, continued through the year 2000, and has been in reruns, TV specials, movies, recent movies, all sorts of merchandising. These characters are some of the most iconic characters of the 21st century or 20th century in American popular culture. And but it's detracted a little bit by having Nancy and Sluggo on the cover. Census count of 43, which is going to tie it with our next book, which is bringing in a new publisher in the Charlton Comics. This is a Lou Morales cover. You got a severed head in the dungeon with this skeleton in chains, and there's a snake, and there's this horrific looking thing, and there's like a kind of gorilla thing, and this is that actually, I think that's the head that was chopped off with the blade. Just a crazy cover. Charlton would be doing some pre-code horror here, and eventually they would have their brief run of superheroes, which still have life to this day. Thing number 5 has a census count of 43. From Story Comics, their top book is Mysterious Adventures number 6 with a Bill Fraccio cover. You got a skeleton. You got a woman in a red dress. Guy with a pistol. So you do have a couple of elements of classic pre-code horror. And this fits the bill. Again, a much smaller publisher, 41 copies on the census. The top book from Ajax Farrell. I'm not sure if did they merge at some point this year, because we did have they had a whole bunch of different imprints, and Ajax Farrell was one of them. So this particular book, I gotta check my notes. Strange Fantasy number 2, which is actually number 1. It's the first issue of the series. A census count of 41. Our top book from Superior Comics is Strange Mysteries number 3. No attribution to the cover, but you got like this vampire popping out of this lady and bats. It is not the most well-drawn cover I've seen from 1952, certainly on this list. Census count of 40. Again, these smaller publishers jumping in with both feet in the horror. Let's move away from horror for another minute and go back to the Peanuts. This is the other book that's the co-first appearance of the Peanuts in comic books. It is United Comics number 21. And it does have an Ernie Bushmiller cover of Fritzy Ritz. It also had our own comic, but Peanuts are a backup in here. We don't see them on the cover. We will see their first cover appearance coming up. Not this year, but a little bit in the future. And this book does have a total of 40 copies on the census. From Stanmore Publications, another war book. It's Battle Cry number 1. Stanmore, a smaller publisher. And you can see he's kind of burning alive this guy with the hammer and sickle tattoo on his hand. I'm wondering if this is supposed to be like a North Korean, because I don't know if the skin tone is yellow to highlight the fire, or to make it that this is supposed to be an Asian character. Any rate, Battle Cry number 1 does have a total of 39 copies on the census. The top book from Standard Comics is... Where are we? Sorry. Unseen number 5, an Alex Toth cover. Again, a well-respected artist that worked well into the 1970s. And this is issue number 5, 38 copies on the census. From Farrell, just Farrell, this is a very expensive book. It is Voodoo Annual number 1. It's the only issue. And we have this guy horrified by this woman, like, reaching out of the coffin, and there's somebody else behind him. There's all sorts of skeletons. This is one of those books that is very valuable. It's a 100-pager. It's thicker, harder to get in any sort of decent condition without spine splitting, and just the cover being mangled. So this ended up with a total of, I have to look elsewhere in my notes, Voodoo Annual number 1 has 38 copies on the census. We haven't seen an Archie book yet. Here it is. It's Ginger number 4 with a George Freese cover. And Ginger lying on her bed on the telephone. No, Biff, I'm not going to prom with you. I'm going with Icky because he's such a gentleman, so noble, so sweet, and because he just got a sleek new sleek red convertible. Ginger, a little bit of a materialist, I guess. At least on this cover, she's not like, making eyes at one of her teachers. So anyway, Ginger number 4, the top book from Archie from 1952, 37 copies on the Census. I don't think there are Archie comics that aren't plentiful, relatively speaking, from 1952, just none that have those covers that really attract, or any first appearances or issue number 1s. Our next book, and we're going to have a tie here, and this is an interesting tie. These next 2 books both have the same census count of 34. The first of them is The Adventures of Rex the Wonder Dog, number 1, which has an Alex Toth and Cy Barry cover. This Rex here, the Wonder Dog, was I guess kind of a takeoff on, a character like Rin Tin Tin in the movies from like the 1920s. And DC was trying other things to appeal to kids. They weren't really jumping into the horrors the other publishers were. This ran for 46 issues through 1959. And this is an example where issue number 1 is not the biggest key in the run. It's the other book that has 34 copies on the Census. That's issue number 4 of Adventures of Rex the Wonder Dog. This is the first appearance of Detective Chimp. This is a Gil Kane and Frank Giacoia cover. Great cover. But it doesn't have Detective Chimp on the cover. Detective Chimp was kind of lost to the dustbins of history for years. And then he was brought back in more recent years as kind of a mystical character. He's been a member of the Justice League Dark. And I think this is the spec book I was talking about. This is the one, right? Phantom Stranger is a spec book. I think this is a bigger spec book because it's harder to find by a lot. And I think Detective Chimp is just going to be one of those characters that's going to resonate with folks if they use him. I think that just, if James Gunn handles it, that could be a really fun character. I'm sorry, Detective Chimp, yeah. So it was funny. Detective Chimp did have reprints in Tarzan 100-page super spectaculars in the 1970s, and I'm pretty sure that Carmine Infantino did the art on that story. So both of these issues of Adventures of Rex the Wonder Dog have a census count of 34. Another from DC Comics. This is House of Mystery number 3, which is a Bob Brown and Ray Burnley cover. The Death of the Dummy. This is a book that did have at least one high sale, and it has 34 copies on the Census. Another very popular book is Frankenstein. This is issue number 20, just listed as a classic cover by Dick Bryfer, and it does have a total of 34 copies on the Census. From Ribage Publishing Corp., this is an issue of Crime Mysteries number 1, and this is much more of the crime cover. You do have the woman in bondage. You have the kind of this grotesque-looking villain in shadows. Crime Mysteries number 1 has 33 copies on the Census. From Cross Publications, their top book is Perfect Crime number 23, with this woman being haunted by this monstrous character with kind of the long Nosferatu-esque fingernails and this grotesque appearance in the mirror on the left. This one has 31 copies on the Census. From Master Publications, their top book is Dark Mysteries number 6, which has a Bill Fraccio cover, a hanging panel, a noose on the cover, skeletons, the femme fatale, I guess, in the red dress. This has a census count of 29. From Orbit. I've never heard of Orbit before. This is our first Orbit book. This is Wanted Comics number 50 with a cover by John Buscema. Interesting cover with this skeleton hanging in the background and the woman running the foreground, and just the use of the pinks and the greens. A really interesting cover, and again, a very early piece of work by John Buscema. This has a total of 25 copies on the Census. We're getting to very rare books now. We're in rarefied air. Up next is This Magazine is Haunted, #3 from Fawcett. Not their most submitted book of the year. Only a very small census count on this. It does have art by Bernard Bailey, Sheldon Moldoff, and Bob Powell. We talked about issues 1 and 2 in last week's episode. This is issue #3 with a census count of, I had it a minute ago, the census count is 19. 19 copies on the census. This is a classic, another expensive book, Pictorial Romances #12, Matt Baker cover. Also interior art. Just 17 copies on the census for this one. From Hillman Periodicals, longtime publisher of Airboy. Airboy was still kicking, I think, until 1954. But what are they going to try? They're going to try Monster Crime Comics #1. This is the only issue of the series. It is kind of crazy. You got this woman with the whip and the bull, she has the whip, and there's a chain in the background, and this guy is just running for his life. So Monster of Crime #1 from Hillman had a total of 17 copies on the census. Lev Gleason. Lev Gleason been around forever. This is Crime and Punishment, issue #56. Again, this guy being tied up on the bed with no mattress, that's kind of, yeah. Kill him and leave him was his motto. The guy's alive, I swear. I don't know where the dough is. Don't let me die. Oh, I guess he has to hold himself up because there's a knife like right underneath his chest that, when he gives up, he falls on, he's going to die. That's pretty clever. This book, just 9 copies on the census. You want to find a harder book to find? This did have a higher sale at some point on Heritage. This is All True Detective Cases. No number from Avon. Woman bound and gagged. The police officer coming to the rescue. Again, this is another giant 100-pager, very thick book. There are 8 copies on the census, which is going to tie it with St. John's All Picture, All True Love Story #1. Another 100-pager, Romance on Route 202. Route 202, there's a Route 202 not far from where I grew up. And that is going to do it for the list. This one also with 8 copies on the census. So let me know what you think of the list. I'd like to thank you for stopping by. Always some surprises, always some books I'd never heard of, and then I get this idea in my mind that I want a copy. So let me know which book most intrigues you on this list or any other book from 1952. I'd like to thank you all for stopping by. You can take a look at a couple of my other videos here. And this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.